Hi folks, welcome to part 2 of Matthew's Theology. Again, this is drawn from the Matera book. In Matera's chapter, he talks about the rejection of Jesus the Messiah, which reaches a climax in chapter 27, verse 25, where we have that rather difficult line about, "Let his blood be upon us and upon our children," uttered by the crowds that are demanding Barabbas rather than Jesus and demanding the death of Jesus. Here in this statement, of course, on one level in the narrative, we see that the burden of guilt, for the gospel anyway, is placed upon the religious leaders and even upon the people of the city who demand Jesus' blood. And of course, we're going to see, as Matera lays out, that this rejection of Jesus is something that has been prepared for throughout the gospel. It is important to note, though, and this is an aside from Matera, that the blood of Jesus, of course, from the Christian perspective, is salvific and transformative. And so you could argue, and I would argue, that when the crowd say, "Let his blood be upon us and upon our children," yes, there is that sense in which what they say is a curse, but there's also the reality that it is a blessing. You could read it almost as a prayer. "Let his blood be upon us and upon our children" could be read as a prayer for redemption or for salvation. Certainly for Matthew's community, the dual nature of this statement would be apparent. But again, tracing the rejection of Jesus, Matera begins with the infant Messiah in the infancy narrative. And so we see Herod and Herod's role at the beginning and the end of the story, in the beginning anyway, with the attempt to take Jesus' life, which results, of course, in the famous death of the innocents and causes Joseph and Mary and Jesus to flee to Egypt. And Herod, again, will play a role then in the judgment of Jesus in the Passion narrative. During Jesus' Galilean ministry, just as we saw in Mark, the opposition to Jesus arises early, and it arises on all sides. So the questions about Jesus or against Jesus really begin with opposition to John. We hear Jesus here rebuke several Galilean cities in very harsh terms, part of that polemical language that is found in Matthew's Gospel. And he accuses this generation of fickleness, meaning that they are not steady or reliable. Furthermore, the Pharisees plot against Jesus, claiming that they want a sign. But of course Jesus will deem them an evil and adulterous generation, so evil in fact that Nineveh, the terrible enemy of Israel, visited by Jonah, Nineveh will rise up and judge this generation. In the parables in chapter 13 we learn that they cannot understand. This fulfills, of course, Isaiah. They have eyes that do not see, ears that do not hear. This is actually, it seems anyway, a traditional early Christian explanation of the mystery of the Jewish rejection of Jesus. So the question being, theologically, why would so many of the chosen people fail to recognize God's Messiah? Well, of course, Christians, Jewish Christians in this case, read the Old Testament, and they see in the Old Testament previous examples of the people refusing to listen to the Lord. And as Isaiah says, they don't have eyes to see or ears to hear. So it appears that these early Jewish Christians took that as a further sign of God's activity in the life and ministry, death and resurrection of Jesus. But of course, for Matthew, the truth of Jesus and his teaching, the mystery, is going to be revealed, but to the disciples. As we approach the Jerusalem ministry, we have further examples or issues concerned with the rejection of Jesus. So we have 3 parables of rejection, whereas Mark had just 2. Now we have the story of the 2 sons, the story of the vineyard, and the story of the wedding feast. It appears that the Messiah is in fact rejecting Israel as Jesus speaks these parables, but as the narrative makes clear, it's really the opposite that's true. They rejected John before him, and now they reject Jesus. And this is not an isolated event, but would, again, from the Christian perspective, the Christian Jewish perspective, be rooted in a long history of people rejecting the will of God, rejecting the prophets, turning away from the Lord, and so forth, that you can find in the Old Testament accounts. Also in Jerusalem, we see a series of controversies with the religious leaders. That concludes with the vehement denunciation of the scribes and the Pharisees. We have 7 woes, the 7th being the most devastating, saying that they are living in the tradition of the murderers of the prophets. And then we have a final lament over Jerusalem. So for Matthew, Jerusalem is a place of danger and intrigue for Jesus. It's really a hotbed of his rejection and opposition. And as we saw in the introduction to the Gospel, it seems likely that Matthew understands the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple as God's judgment upon that rejection of the Messiah.